There is an image that practically everyone who has heard of the apocalypse carries in the head. The beast, a unique figure, an ultimate leader, the great enemy of the end times. For many people, the reasoning seems simple. The beast is the Antichrist. But when you open the text of Revelation itself, a curious thing happens. This fusion simply doesn't appear there. The book's most famous chapter, Revelation 13, doesn't just feature one beast. It features two. First, a creature that emerges from the sea. Then, another that emerges from the earth. The two operate together, but they do not do the same thing, and that should raise an uncomfortable question. If the beast is a single final eschatological figure, why does the text describe an entire acting structure with different roles? But the strangeness doesn't end there. Throughout the apocalypse itself, yet another figure appears associated with this gear, that which will later be called a false prophet. So the scenario that the text constructs is not exactly that of a single character dominating everything. It's more like a power system operating in layers. A force that dominates, another that promotes, another that legitimizes. It may seem like a small detail, but this is where the story begins to change direction. Because the question that almost always comes up in conversations about the end times is, who is the beast? But perhaps the original question of the text was different. What kind of power does this beast represent? Now comes the element that complicates the picture even further. The most famous name in Christian eschatology, Antichrist, does not even appear in the apocalypse. It appears elsewhere, in another type of text, in another context. Still, over the centuries, these different images began to come together. First, as comparisons, then as overlays, until at some point in the history of interpretation, three distinct figures ended up merging in the Christian imagination: the beast, the false prophet, and the Antichrist. Today, this fusion seems so natural that almost no one realizes that it needed to be built, not in the text, but in the way the text has been read throughout history. So the question driving this episode is not simply who the beast is. The question is more structural. When exactly did the beast become the Antichrist? Because for a long time, these two things were not the same figure. And understanding how they ended up becoming one perhaps reveals something deeper about the apocalypse itself, not just about the end times, but about how certain ideas are born, compete for space, and end up shaping what that the whole world starts to imagine when they think about the end. If the fusion between beast and Antichrist does not appear explicitly in the text of Revelation, so it's worth doing something that rarely happens when this topic comes up. Return to the very chapter where it all begins. Revelation 13. It is there that the narrative introduces one of the most striking images in the entire book. But what often goes unnoticed is that Juan does not describe a single agent dominating the scenario. He describes a sequence of appearances. First, the creature that would become the most famous appears, the beast that emerges from the sea. The scene begins with a powerful image, the agitated sea from which a creature with multiple heads, horns, and authority received to rule. The language is symbolic, dense, full of echoes of previous texts, especially the book of Daniel. This first beast receives power, exercises dominion, and impresses the nations. There is admiration fear, and submission. The text describes something greater than a simple ruler. The scenario is more reminiscent of an imperial power structure, a power that conquers, dominates, and demands loyalty. But when the reader starts to get used to this figure, the narrative does something curious. She introduces another beast, this time not from the sea, but from the earth. This second creature does not appear with the same political grandeur as the first. Acting is different. Instead of governing directly, it operates in favor of the first beast. She promotes, convinces, organizes signals, builds legitimacy. The text describes someone who makes the earth and its inhabitants pay homage to the first beast. She also performs public signs that reinforce this authority. The relationship between the two is not one of rivalry. It is functional cooperation. The first exercises dominance. The second sustains this dominance through influence, persuasion, and legitimation. In other words, the chapter does not present just one agent of power. Features a gear. And there is one more important detail. Later, throughout the apocalypse itself, this second figure comes to be identified with a title that would become famous in Christian tradition, the false prophet. This name does not appear at the beginning of the narrative, but appears later to describe this same force which operates by promoting the authority of the beast. And here a distinction appears that many popular readings end up ignoring. The sea beast represents dominant power. The beast of the earth, later associated with the false prophet, represents ideological and religious of this power. It may seem like a subtle difference, but it profoundly changes the architecture of the scene. Because evil in the apocalypse does not appear only as brute force. It also appears as persuasion, propaganda, and legitimation. Now it is worth observing a second text that expands this picture even further. Revelation 17. In this chapter, the beast reappears associated with an image even more charged with symbolism, the figure of a woman sitting on it. The description is not presented as an unsolvable enigma. On the contrary, the text itself offers interpretative clues. It talks about kingdoms, kings, political power, and dominion over people. The language remains symbolic, but the scenario clearly points to something bigger than an isolated character. It points to a structured political reality. This is a crucial point. When Revelation presents the beast, it does not describe just one individual. It describes a power that operates within a concrete historical order, a power that governs, a power that promotes itself, a power that legitimizes itself. And this division of functions is not a secondary detail of the narrative. It is part of the way the book itself organizes its vision of the conflict between authority, human, and divine sovereignty. Now, it's worth noting something that often goes unnoticed. Up to this point in the Revelation narrative, none of these figures are given the name it would later dominate Christian imagination. None of them are called Antichrist. The word simply does not appear here. This does not mean that the themes are not related, but it does mean that at the time the text was written, the symbolic architecture was organized differently. Instead of a single figure concentrating all functions, Revelation presents a composite structure, a force that dominates, another that promotes, another that supports the symbolic authority of this domain. It may seem like just a literary nuance, but it is precisely in this nuance that the question that crosses the entire story begins to appear: history of interpretation. If the text presents different roles, at what point did these figures come to be seen as a single entity, final eschatological? This change did not happen within the chapter. It happened later in the way later generations tried to organize and connect the symbols scattered throughout the scriptures. And that's exactly where the story starts to get even more interesting. When Revelation describes the beast rising from the sea, the modern reader often imagines something that will appear in the future: a world leader, an ultimate ruler, a character who has not yet entered the story. But for those who heard this text for the first time at the end of the first century, the sensation it was probably quite different, because the world in which the apocalypse circulated was already full of symbols of power, that they looked a lot like what John described. The sea, for example, was not just a dramatic setting. In the symbolic language of biblical tradition, the sea often represented the chaos of nations, the unstable movement of peoples and empires that rose and dominated territories. This detail changes the image a lot. When the beast emerges from the sea, the scene need not necessarily be read as the emergence of an unexpected individual. It can be read as the appearance of a power that rises from the scene, turbulent history of human history, a political power, an imperial power, a power that dominates different people. This type of reading does not come out of nowhere. It directly echoes one of the most influential prophetic texts for Revelation, the book of Daniel. In Daniel, symbolic creatures that emerge from the sea also appear, and in that context, the text itself associates these figures with kingdoms and powers that dominate the world. In other words, the idea of representing empires through symbolic beasts was already part of the apocalyptic repertoire. Joan does not invent this type of language. He works inside her. Now imagine the historical setting in which the first Christians heard these images. The Roman Empire dominated vast regions of the known world. His authority was political, military, and also symbolic. Rome didn't just rule territories. She too constructed narratives of loyalty and reverence to the emperor. In many cities of the empire, there were temples dedicated to the imperial cult. Loyalty to the emperor could take on almost religious contours. In this environment, political power and symbolic legitimation often went hand in hand. And it is precisely here that the architecture of Revelation 13 begins to make more sense. The first beast represents the dominant power, you, a force that governs, demands submission, and exercises authority over nations. But the narrative doesn't stop at that point. She introduces a second figure, the beast that arises from the earth. And this second figure does not conquer territories. She does something different. It promotes the authority of the former. She organizes public signs. She convinces. It creates mechanisms that lead people to recognize and revere dominant power. When Revelation describes this performance, the ancient reader could recognize something familiar. Not just governments dominating people, but entire systems that produce loyalty, admiration, and the cult of power. This distinction changes more than it seems, because the evil described in Revelation does not just appear as direct oppression. It also appears as ideological seduction, as public narrative, like propaganda. Power dominates. But it also needs to be legitimized, and this legitimation can take religious, symbolic, or cultural forms. It is at this point that Revelation 17 expands the picture even further. There, the beast appears associated with a female figure sitting on him, an image loaded with symbolism that the text itself interprets as a dominant city over the kings of the earth. The language remains symbolic, but the interpretative direction is clear. The text connects the beast to real structures of historical power. It's not just about imagining a mysterious character in the future. It's about recognizing how systems of domination work within history. It may seem strange to those who grew up hearing Revelation as a detailed map of the end of the world. But in their original environment, many of these images probably functioned as symbolic criticism of the imperial power that shaped the life of Christian communities. This does not eliminate the eschatological dimension of the book. The apocalypse continues to look to the future and the final outcome of history. But he does this by looking at it from a concrete historical reality. The beast does not appear as an abstract concept. It appears as a symbol of a type of power that could already be recognized in the world, a power that dominates, a power that promotes itself, a power that demands reverence. When this reading becomes visible, the central question changes shape. Instead of just asking who the beast will be, another possibility arises. Perhaps the text is describing how certain systems of power operate throughout the world. History. And it is exactly at this point that the interpretation begins to divide, because some reading traditions have maintained this historical and symbolic focus, while others began, little by little, to reorganize these images around a single final eschatological figure. And to understand how this change happened, it is necessary to look at another element that circulated in the first Christian communities, a term that does not appear in Revelation, but which would end up becoming one of the most famous words in all of Christian eschatology: Antichrist. After following the images of the apocalypse, it is natural that many people expect Antichrist. But when the reader looks for this word within the book of Revelation itself, it simply doesn't appear, not once. This may seem like a technicality, but historically, it's an important clue, because the term Antichrist appears elsewhere in the New Testament, and in a context very different. It appears in the letters attributed to John, especially in the first epistle. There, the setting is not one of symbolic visions, monstrous beasts, or imperial structures. Described in apocalyptic language, the environment is different. The focus is pastoral. The author writes for communities facing internal tensions, teaching disputes and conflicts over the identity of Jesus. It is in this context that the word appears, and it appears in a curious way, not as the name of a single character at the end of the story, but as an opposition category. The letter speaks of people who denied certain central elements of the Christian faith and describes this type of stance as being Antichrist. In other words, the term is used to characterize an attitude, a theological position, or a movement of denial. At a certain point, the text states something that often goes unnoticed. He says that many antichrists had already arisen. This phrase creates an interesting contrast to how the word is usually used today. In the popular imagination, the Antichrist almost always became a single figure, a final leader who will appear shortly before the end of the story. But as it appears In the Johannine letters, the term describes something broader, a type of opposition, a force of denial, a movement that could appear at different times. This difference in usage does not mean that the themes are completely disconnected. The first Christian communities already reflected on the confrontation between truth and deception, fidelity and opposition, legitimate authority and deceitful authority. These themes run through several New Testament texts, but each book works on these tensions with its own language. The letters speak in terms of teaching and denial. Revelation speaks in terms of power, dominion, and the cult of power. It may seem like just a difference in literary style. But this is where one of the most interesting questions in the history of interpretation. If the texts present different images to describe opposing forces, what happens when later readers try to put these images together into the same structure explanatory? At some point, Christian readers began to notice possible parallels. Revelation described a power that rose up against God and demanded absolute loyalty. The letters spoke of forces that denied the truth and opposed the identity of Christ. The association seemed tempting, not because the texts explicitly stated that they were the same thing, but because the themes seemed to converge. This is how, little by little, some interpreters began to bring these figures closer together, first as interpretive comparisons, then as possible identities. The beast could represent the same type of opposition described in the cards. The power described in Revelation could be the most extreme historical manifestation of that spirit of denial. At this early stage, however, the merger was not yet complete. The beast continued to be read within the symbolic scenario of the apocalypse. Antichrist continued to be a term that circulated in another type of text. But the idea that these elements could fit within the same narrative began to gain space. And it is precisely at this point that something interesting happens in the history of interpretation. Readers stop looking at each text in isolation, and they begin to try to organize all the eschatological signs into a single picture coherent. When this process begins, different symbols start to be brought together. Distinct characters begin to be compared. Similar functions become approximate. It may seem like just a natural effort at theological organization, but it is precisely in this movement that the history of Christian eschatology begins to change direction. Because when trying to connect images scattered across different texts, interpreters would end up producing something that the biblical text itself never explicitly presented. A single final figure concentrating several of these images at the same time. But this merger did not happen all at once. It was the result of debates, competing readings, and different attempts to organize the same set of texts. And for a considerable period of Christian history, these readings were still in use. Dispute. It is exactly this dispute that begins to appear when we observe the interpretations that circulated in the first centuries of the Christian tradition. When the first Christian generations began to reflect on apocalyptic texts, they did not inherit a completely organized eschatological system. They inherited powerful images, but these images were scattered across different genres, in different books, and in different contexts. Revelation spoke of beasts, kingdoms, symbolic numbers, and power structures. The letters spoke of antichrists emerging within their own communities. Other New Testament texts mentioned figures such as the man of lawlessness. The result was a set of symbols that pointed to similar tensions: opposition to God, deception, corrupt power, but which were not organized into a single linear narrative. Therefore, when Christian interpreters began to deal with these texts, there was no just a dominant reading. Several appeared. Some readings remained closer to the historical environment in which Revelation was written. In these interpretations, the beast was understood mainly as a symbol of structures, of power that had marked the world of the first century. The Roman Empire frequently appeared in this interpretative horizon, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as the concrete political reality that shaped the experience of the first Christian communities. Within this reading, the symbolic strength of the apocalypse was precisely in its capacity to talk about how imperial power organizes itself, demands loyalty, and transforms political authority into an object of reverence. In this type of interpretation, the beast did not need to be a future eschatological character. She already represented something recognizable within the story itself. But this was not the only way to read the text. Other traditions began to emphasize something different. They realized that Revelation also spoke of a final confrontation between evil and evil, government of God. This opened space for a more future-oriented reading. From this perspective, the images in the book did not just describe powers of the past. They pointed to a final intensification of these forces before the outcome of the history. Here, an interesting transition begins to appear. The beast could still represent historical structures of power, but it was also beginning to be seen as a sign anticipating something greater that was yet to come. Meanwhile, another element continued to circulate in Christian reflections: the term Antichrist. As we have seen, in the Johannine letters, he appeared more broadly, describing forces of opposition that were already active. But when readers began to put together different eschatological texts, this term, it also came to be associated with the idea of a final, concentrated opposition. From that point on, some readings began to go a step further. If the apocalypse spoke of a power that would dominate nations, if other texts spoke of a figure who would rise up against God, perhaps these images were describing different aspects of the same reality future. This reasoning did not come all at once. It appeared gradually, first as an approximation, then as a hypothesis. And in certain interpretive circles, it began to gain traction as a way of organizing the set of eschatological expectations. But for a long time, these readings continued to coexist. Some interpreters kept the symbolic reading linked to the imperial context. Others emphasized the future dimension of the images, and others tried to build a synthesis that brought together several of these figures in the same eschatological character. This period in the history of interpretation is especially interesting because it reveals something that often disappears on subsequent readings: the real dispute between interpretations. Nothing was completely stabilized yet. The relationship between beast, false prophet, man of lawlessness, and Antichrist was still the subject of reflection, comparison, and debate. Each attempt to organize these figures produced a slightly different eschatological map. Different. Some maps kept the symbols more distributed, others began to concentrate them, and this apparently small difference would begin, little by little, to alter the entire form how the Christian imagination would see the end of history. Because when different symbols are brought together within a single character, the narrative becomes simpler, more dramatic, easier to transmit. And it was exactly this type of reorganization that, at a certain moment in the history of interpretation, ended up changing the dominant direction of Christian eschatology. A moment in which several of these images, previously distributed, began to be converged, no longer in a complex symbolic system, but in a single concentrating figure of eschatological evil. It is this turning point that needs to be observed more closely. Until now, the interpretive landscape was still relatively open. The texts existed, the images circulated, but the way to organize them was not yet completely defined. The beast appeared in the Apocalypse linked to power structures. The term Antichrist appeared in letters describing opposition and denial. Other passages spoke of figures who would rise up against God at the end of history. These elements were recognized as related to the same great theme, but the way to connect them still varied. It was only a few centuries later that an interpretative reorganization began to take hold, strength, and this reorganization produced something new. Instead of treating these images as symbols distributed across different layers of the biblical text, some interpreters began to bring them together within a single figure concentrating eschatology. This movement did not emerge from a single work or a single author. It happened gradually within the tradition of Christian reading that sought to harmonize different passages of Scripture. One question guided this effort. If several texts speak of a final opposition to God, would it be possible that they were all describing the same character under different images? This hypothesis began to organize the material in a new way. The beast of the Apocalypse could be read as the political manifestation of this ultimate enemy. The term Antichrist could name the spiritual and doctrinal dimension of this opposition. Other eschatological figures could represent different aspects of the same reality. With this type of reading, the set of eschatological expectations began to converge. The complex symbolic scenario of the Apocalypse came to be interpreted as the portrait of a single, evil, ultimate protagonist. This reorganization had some clear advantages. It simplified the narrative. Instead of several symbols distributed throughout different texts, there was now an axis central, a final enemy, a leader who would bring together the forces of opposition to God. This synthesis also facilitated the transmission of eschatological expectations in communities Christians. Stories are easier to communicate when they have defined characters, and the figure of a final adversary concentrating the evil in history had a narrative force powerful. It is in this environment that the fusion between beast and Antichrist begins to become more and more common. Not because the biblical text had explicitly declared this identity, but because the interpretative tradition began to see these images as pieces of a same puzzle. Gradually, the distinction between political symbol, deceptive religious force, and opposition spirituality began to diminish. These dimensions began to be read as different manifestations of the same figure. This process developed throughout the late Christian tradition and continued to gain form during the Middle Ages. Authors, preachers, and interpreters began to present the final enemy of history as someone who would bring together characteristics present in several biblical passages. He would have political authority. He would exert deceptive religious influence. He would directly oppose God. He would bring together signs that readers had found in different texts. Thus, little by little, the symbolic landscape of the apocalypse was reorganized within of a more concentrated narrative. Now there was a character, the Antichrist. And within this new synthesis, the beast came to be seen not only as a symbol of imperial power, but as the political expression of this ultimate adversary. This was the point at which the interpretation changed direction. Before, the images were distributed. Then they started to converge. Before, revelation could be read as a symbolic critique of historical systems of power. Afterwards, it began to be frequently read as an advanced description of the performance of a unique eschatological leader. This change did not completely eliminate the other readings, but she ended up becoming extremely influential, largely because it offered something that many religious traditions value deeply: narrative clarity. When the expectation of the end of the story is organized around a character specific, the story becomes easier to imagine, tell, and convey. But here comes a question that is rarely asked. What would have happened if the other reading had remained dominant? If the interpretation that emphasizes the beast as a symbol of historical systems of power had remained at the center of Christian tradition? Perhaps the modern eschatological imaginary was quite different. Instead of constantly searching for a single mysterious world leader, perhaps many readers were more attentive to how structures of power, propaganda, and cult politics are organized throughout history. But the history of interpretation followed a different path. The synthesis that brought together several of these images into a single character proved to be more powerful as a narrative, and over time, this narrative ended up shaping the way much of the world Christian began to imagine the end of times. The beast is no longer just a symbol within a system. She came to be seen as the political face of the Antichrist. And when this merger was consolidated, something curious happened. Many people began to read the text of Revelation itself as if this identity had always been there from the beginning. Even though, historically, this association was built later along the way covered by Christian interpretation. After the fusion between these figures began to stabilize in the Christian tradition, the next process was almost inevitable. The new synthesis began to circulate, first between interpreters, then among preachers, then between entire communities, and over time, what had been an interpretative attempt ended up becoming the more familiar way of imagining the end times. The beast no longer appeared only as a symbol within a system of power. She came to be understood as the final ruler of this system. Antichrist, in turn, ceased to be a broader category of opposition to make a specific character from the future story. And in this reorganization, the functions that were previously distributed among several images, they began to concentrate. The political power described in Revelation, the spiritual opposition mentioned in the letters, the deceptive figure who promotes false authority. All of this began to converge in the image of a single eschatological leader. This convergence ended up profoundly shaping later Christian imagination. In popular catechesis, in sermons, in biblical commentaries, and in eschatological narratives, the story began to be told in an increasingly direct way. At the end of the story, a great adversary will emerge. This opponent will concentrate political power. He will deceive multitudes. He will set himself in opposition to God, and his performance will culminate in the final confrontation described in the Scriptures. This narrative has an evident pedagogical force. It organizes complex symbols into a story that can be easily conveyed. But at the same time, it produces a silent effect. The original distinction between the figures begins to disappear from the collective memory. The beast, the false prophet, and the Antichrist come to be seen as parts of the same almost automatic identity. When this process reaches the modern world, it encounters a cultural environment that extends this simplification even further. Literature, cinema, and popular culture quickly adopt the figure of the eschatological leader. Unique, the image of a global, charismatic, and deceitful ruler becomes one of the most recognizable representations of apocalyptic imagery. And so, what began as an interpretative reorganization within the tradition, Christian ends up becoming one of the most well-known characters in culture contemporary religion. Today, many people hear the word beast and immediately think of Antichrist, almost as if the two terms had always been synonymous. But historically, this equivalence was constructed. She didn't show up ready. It formed slowly as generations of readers tried to connect, simplify, and organize the complex images present in biblical texts. And when this construction was consolidated, the result was one of the most lasting symbols of all Christian eschatology. When Revelation was written, it did not present a single figure concentrating all the forces of eschatological evil. He presented a symbolic architecture, a beast that dominates, another force that promotes this dominance, a mechanism that mixes political power, public legitimization, and the demand for loyalty. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the term Antichrist appears, describing opposition, denial, and deception in another type of scenario. For some time, these images circulated side by side without forming a single character. But the history of interpretation changed this picture. Readers began to connect the signals. Symbols have been approximated, functions were combined, until, little by little, the beast and the Antichrist began to inhabit the same figure within of the Christian imagination. Not because the text was born that way, but because, over the centuries, this synthesis ended up becoming the most powerful way to tell the story of the end. And when that story won, it began to seem to almost everyone as if it had always been there from the beginning. Now we're not just looking at text. We are looking at how an idea took shape through history,